SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement, the Queer Arts Festival, SFU Galleries, and SFU School for Contemporary Arts and the Institute for Performance Studies are very pleased to co-present tonight's lecture by Jonathan D. Katz, How AIDS Changed American Art. It's so great to partner like this. And this talk is particularly apt in relationship to the SFU Gallery's O'Dane Gallery exhibition downstairs, which I'm sorry is closed at this time, but it's called My Epidemic by the French artist Lily Reynaud-Dewar, which engages texts influenced by AIDS and its impact on bodies and cultures. So if you haven't seen the show already, I do encourage you to at least look through the window tonight and come back and see it. And now S.D. Holman, the artistic director of the Queer Arts Festival, will introduce Jonathan.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm S.D. Holman. I'm the artistic director for the Queer Arts Festival in Vancouver. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish Nations. There are no treaties on this land, so it is by their leave that we are here. So thank you. I'd also like to thank SFU, Woodward's Office of Community Engagement, and the Listel Hotel, Vancouver's most artful hotel, for sponsoring tonight's talk with us. I'm thrilled to welcome tonight one of my personal heroes, Dr. Jonathan David Katz, as a visual artist and curator for our upcoming Queer Arts Festival this June 2016. Katz is in town doing studio visits as part of his curation, so we seized the opportunity to have him speak and introduce Vancouver to one of queer theory's most game-changing intelligences. Jonathan David Katz is a pioneering academic and gay activist who works at the intersection of art history and queer history. Widely recognized as a leading authority in queer art history, his work as a curator, scholar, and activist has a profound impact on the understanding of queer art and artists in both academia and the larger world. The first full-time American academic to be tenured in gay and lesbian studies, Katz currently directs SUNY Buffalo's PhD program in visual studies. He founded the Harvey Milk Institute, the world's largest queer studies institute, and serves as president and chief curator of New York City's Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art. His recent work includes co-curating Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Art, an exhibition at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery that broke ground as the first exhibition at a major American museum to focus on LGBTQ issues. His talk today, How AIDS Changed American Art, relates to the exhibit he is currently co-curating at the Tacoma Art Museum, Art, AIDS, and America. It's open until January 10th, 2016, so take a drive and check it out. It then goes to Atlanta, New York, and Chicago. And of course, don't miss this next year's exhibition. He'll be curating for Queer Arts Festival, Drama Queer, Seducing Social Change, coming to the Roundhouse in June 2016. Sign up to our mailing list at the table outside if you'd like a reminder. And without further ado, Jonathan Katz.
Thank you so much, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. My subject today, that AIDS fundamentally changed North American art and culture, should seem self-evident, but all too often that is not the case. For example, more Americans have died of AIDS than all the wars my nation has fought since its independence added together, with the exception of the Civil War, a fact that speaks to the scale and scope of the new plague that beset us over 3 decades ago. We readily credit any one of these wars with a profound impact and routinely make them our key defining historical markers. And yet of AIDS' impact on our commonality, we are routinely, unjustifiably, notably silent. The thesis that undergirds my newest exhibition, Art, AIDS, America, that opened just this last October at the Tacoma Art Museum, is exactly this: that AIDS is the motor for some of the most substantial changes in the development of North American culture up until the present day. It's a large exhibition, about 135 works, and I'll be showing you just a few of them today. Central to the organization of the exhibition is the claim that we repress any account of the impact of AIDS in American art the way we have repressed AIDS' impact in every sphere of our culture, a sign, psychoanalysts warn us, of its great power. We repeatedly frame AIDS as a tragic tangent, a sterile byway that has left the art world largely unchanged. My exhibition instead argues exactly the converse, that AIDS is the single most potent force shaping the development of American art over the last several decades, and in what follows, I'm going to try to prove my admittedly provocative, admittedly unsubtle claim. When we discuss AIDS today, that is, when we deign to mention it at all, it always seems to assume one of only two forms, either a somber necrology resulting in the recitation of the dead and our concomitant cultural loss with or without ritual breastfeeding, or as the historical context for the development of the US culture wars in the early 1980s. And I'm showing you here an image from perhaps the defining image from those culture wars. This was, of course, the moment that saw the cancellation of Robert Mapplethorpe's The Perfect Moment exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery of Art, and a group of activists, myself included, met and decided we needed to respond. And so what we did was actually project the banned works on the marble walls of the Corcoran at night so that they would not win. What these twinned responses share is that both serve to safely sequester AIDS in the past, confining it to a social universe that is by definition severed from our own. AIDS is represented as an historical threat before new drug regimens broke the back of the epidemic and hunted it back to small pockets of chronic eradicability born of ostensibly high-risk behavior. Accordingly, AIDS hit some of us harder than others, decimated some communities more than others, but apparently it barely grazed us collectively at all. Replicating the us-then dynamic that haunted and impeded early efforts to organize against the threat, AIDS has become their disease, not ours. To make of AIDS an active historical protagonist requires understanding that it is in fact ours, a collective trauma with a collective impact. But the fact that 90% of AIDS art doesn't look like AIDS art and isn't understood as AIDS art, whatever its actual origins, is the key point. It looks like this. I'm showing you Ross Bleckner's Deathlessness from 1987. Like most AIDS art, it's not strident or overtly political. It doesn't represent diseased bodies or dying figures or contain explosive political statements. And it doesn't do so because it couldn't. We too readily forget that in the 1980s there were laws in place, US laws, that censored any art about AIDS in the context of desire or sexuality. As a result, an entire generation of artists began to think about their representational practices first and foremost strategically, trying to understand the array of forces marshaled against them and seeking to circumvent, confront, or flout these new AIDS-phobic and homophobic laws. These artists were thus forced to engage in a complicated calculus, whereby any work of art was tested against complex reading of extant social networks and discursive conditions, prejudices, and stereotypes, laws, customs, and institutional parameters to yield a work precisely calibrated to function in the space between possibility and foreclosure, influence and censorship. Supremely alive to the discursive affect of their work, this AIDS generation learned expertly how to read the weather, frequently tacking or even dissimulating if that was required. Above all, they pioneered a highly self-conscious means of seeding but never determining a work's significance, of saying things without attribution, camouflaging their meanings as seamlessly and as self-evidently as many of them camouflage their hand in the art object's making. To challenge this seeming silence, we must attend not to the macro effects of AIDS, but to the micro ones. Most centrally, the way it subtly redrew the parameters of art world discourse, and thus also redrew artists' own tactical thinking as they sought to represent AIDS. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. A sculpture by Scott Burton that camouflaged itself as a chair, even calling itself two-part chair. Two-part chair initially sat among a group of other chairs in a New York office tower lobby, seemingly an example of the kind of bland corporate art of the 1980s boom era. Inoffensive, apolitical, updating, but not essentially challenging the minimalist aesthetic that still dominated the sculptural world. But look again, of course. Do you see how this chair insinuates gay sex, anal intercourse, unmarked even as one sat in it? Ostensibly, innocently occupying the center hall of repressive authority, two-part chair perfectly encapsulates the strategic thinking that is one legacy of the art of AIDS. Here's another one. A sculpture by Felix Gonzalez Torres called Perfect Lovers. It consists of two commercially available clocks, battery operated, on a wall, made at the moment that Felix Gonzalez Torres had come to understand that his partner was dying. And of course, like any two battery operated clocks, they will eventually go out of sync and stop. But placed as it is on the wall, generally above the reception hall of a museum, it doesn't call even attention to itself as an artwork. To better understand this work, allow me to quote a statement by the artist. Quote, "At this point, I do not want to be outside the structure of power. I do not want to be the opposition, the alternative. The alternative to what? To power? No, I want to have power. It's effective in terms of change. I want to be like a virus that belongs to the institution. All the ideological apparatuses are, in other words, replicating themselves, because that's the way culture works. So if I function as a virus, an imposter, an infiltrator, I will always replicate myself together with those institutions." End quote. Imposters and infiltrators, of course, succeed only when they are well camouflaged. Dissimulation, hiding, and absolute self-awareness are the hallmarks of their achievement. What Gonzalez Torres meant by being an infiltrator and imposter nearly 2 decades ago has become, I want to argue, almost second nature to young artists today. Centered on a kind of dissimulation of authoriality, a camouflaged authoriality, an AIDS generation taught contemporary artists that making a statement did not necessarily entail forthright admission, and that clues, silences, elisions, hints could possess, in the right context, an unusually expressive eloquence. When an HIV-positive artist not only allies himself with a virus, but discursively personifies it, as Felix Gonzalez Torres just did, we know something important is happening. When HIV infects a body, its evolutionary stroke of genius is to turn the immune system's own defenses against the body itself. The AIDS retrovirus attaches onto particular infection-fighting white blood cells, the so-called CD4 T helper cells, inserting its own RNA into the host cell where it is converted into DNA. Thus infected, the cell now produces and releases millions of replicas of itself, thereby turning the body's infection-fighting cells into an HIV factory, pumping out new viruses that repeat the process with other cells. And because the infection is housed within the host's own white blood cells, the body's remaining healthy, disease-fighting cells cannot recognize it and thus do not attack. The immune system eventually exhausts itself and the host dies from one or another opportunistic infection, thus the word syndrome in acquired immune deficiency syndrome. In the context of the art world's immune system, that frame both homosexuality and AIDS as dangerous invaders to be eliminated, Numerous artists, beginning as early as 1982 with the first stirrings of what would become full-scale culture war, pioneered a new viral approach to confronting the exclusionary, defensive, infection-fighting force that is the museum. In one of the great historical ironies of the era, these artists took HIV, the very virus that was killing them, as the blueprint and the battle plan for a similarly clandestine and camouflaged attack. In their hands, the very glossary of AIDS, viral, clandestine camouflage, unwitting replication, infection, became the lexicon of an art world that knew, like HIV itself, that the immune system was the best vector of attack precisely because once it was infected, it could not attack itself. So I'm showing you one of the earliest works of art about AIDS. One, mind you, that isn't ever discussed as a work of art about AIDS. It's Jasper Johns' Perilous Night, and while I desperately wanted it to include it in Art AIDS America, Mr. Johns did not agree. It's one of his most important images, and instead he gave me a piece that was produced for an AIDS auction. But Perilous Night is important precisely because it helps us to understand the extraordinarily Baroque and complicated range of references that an artist like Johns evoked in 1982 to talk about AIDS. The title comes from a John Cage composition called Perilous Night. That composition by John Cage was made at the moment that John Cage was divorcing his wife Xenia and becoming involved with his partner, subsequently a partner of nearly 50 years, Merce Cunningham. He writes, Cage does, in an article about Perilous Night, that he produced this musical work, quote, at a moment when love had become unhappy. But more importantly, he also noted that at this moment in his life, he was bereft, coming to terms with his sexuality. And he poured all that emotion into the work. And then when the work was first performed, he said, nobody understood what I was feeling. And so, and this is a Cage quote, I came to realize that expression in art was not possible, end quote. Thus, right, Cage's use of chance procedures in his subsequent compositional methods. Now that's really important because what Johns does to express himself about AIDS is choose a defining work by his friend John Cage that refuses the possibility of emotional expression. And indeed, that is a sheet of music on the far side of the canvas, the far right, from Perilous Night, along with these arms that hang as if covered with Kaposi sarcoma, right, lesions, and a hidden and coded element that Johns employed. That coded element came from one of the most important works of Renaissance art, and I'll be talking about in just a second, the Eisenheim altarpiece. But as well, Johns is informed by a work that is the title of the print that's in the upper right. That print is called Between the Clock and the Bed. And it comes from this work by Edvard Munch, a paradoxical self-portrait because it doesn't really, address the artist, but rather merely the space between the clock and the bed. And you will, of course, notice that the chevrons on the bed are mimicked in Johns's print. But the Eisenheim altarpiece is equally important as a source. And the Eisenheim altarpiece was made for a hospital in France during the early Renaissance for people who had skin diseases born of eating infected rye. Those skin diseases tended to cause bloating and bursting lesions. And so in the Eisenheim altarpiece, and here you have an example of the Christ figure, every figure has bloodied, torn, tortured skin, a means of presumably comfort. It's this figure that is the defining figure for the Eisenheim, in the Eisenheim altarpiece that Johns takes. It's from the Visions of St. Anthony panel, and it shows exactly the effects of that poisoning with the bursting lesions, which, of course, for Johns in 1982 seemed reminiscent of HIV. Indeed, here in a drawing for Perilous Night, you can see the figure upside down and reversed, along with the hand and the sheet of music that says Perilous Night, or as clearly as I can give it to you. So Johns gives us an incredibly complicated and baroque chain of references that took years to actually trace. But when he was asked in an interview in the New York Times Magazine as to why he was engaging in these kinds of themes, he said, well, so many of my friends have died. And then he caught himself and said, you know, when you get to my age, your friends start to die, eliminating the political context. My point is that these iconic works of a generation of artists informed by AIDS seem to have very little in common. Johns, right, Burton. Yet these artists successfully found a way to instrumentalize most of the key directions taken by contemporary American art up to that point, and to lend them a peculiar form of political content and expressive possibility. In turning the work's formal or inward-looking innovations outwards toward an audience, they found a way to make the art address AIDS connotatively, but rarely denotatively. Fully aware of the politics of the moment, they knew that to name AIDS directly in their art was to be, by definition, excluded. And so they made the audience their expressive ally, capable of reading meanings they knew never to state directly. Like here. I'm showing you Felix Gonzalez's Torres' Untitled North, one of his light string works, vaguely metaphorical about place, a here and a there, a curtain between two spaces, vaguely reminiscent of the celestial. It works, in Felix Gonzalez Torres' own words, like this. I quote him. I love the idea of being an infiltrator. I always said that I wanted to be a spy. I want my work to look like something else, non-artistic, yet beautifully simple. I don't want to be the opposition because the opposition always serves a purpose. It says, improve your arms against me. But if you're the spy, always straight acting, always within the system, you're the person they fear the most because you're one of them, and you become impossible to define. End quote. Formally and theoretically sophisticated, spare, and elegant, AIDS artists like Gonzalez Torres evaded the art world's immune system precisely to the degree that their work became the material obverse of a recognizable image of either homosexuality or AIDS. Instead of hot politics or messy embodiment, a figuration redolent of sex and leaking infected bodily fluids, these artists chose a cool post-minimalist abstraction, the calculated language of the spy. Tellingly, this camouflage clandestine language seemed to echo an earlier avant-garde moment equally associated with expressive opacity and strategic self-positioning. The immediately post-abstract expressionist art of the figure I just showed you, Jasper Johns, along with John Cage and Johns' lover, Robert Rauschenberg, and Rauschenberg's lover, Cy Twombly. The parallel is very much to the point. Queer artists in the virulently homophobic 50s, subjected to gay baiting from the federal level on down, shared a culture not so dissimilar from the virulently homophobic art world at the time of AIDS' worst ravages. And importantly, the dominant metaphor for homosexuality at the moment that these artists first achieved their reputation was not our metaphor of the closet, but the earlier metaphor they employed was of the spy. I'm showing you one of the most famous works, Grand Furies Let the Record Show. What made the record show a complicated work is that this very first museum exhibition about AIDS, completed in 1987 under the aegis of the great curator, himself a person with AIDS, Bill Olander at the New Museum, used expressly metaphors related to the Holocaust. That is, in fact, an image of the trials at Nuremberg. In front of that image, you'll see that there are 7 heads silhouetted, one in light. The light moved, so each of the figures got silhouetted in turn. In front of the image, in front of the figures, there's a sort of sheet of blank paper with their words on it, generally virulently homophobic words. William F. Buckley is quoted famously as recommending that people with HIV have the word HIV tattooed on their buttocks and put in concentration camps. That's there. Ronald Reagan, however, the figure you're looking at, has nothing written on his blank paper because in 1987, Ronald Reagan had not yet uttered the word AIDS. This after over 45,000 Americans were dead and hundreds of thousands infected. None of these new art world strategies can make sense unless arrayed against the overheated social and political conflicts of the time. This was, after all, the era of culture war in the United States, when cynical right-wing politicians instrumentalized the dead and dying to advance their own political agenda. Given the extremely aggressive political, which is to say ideological control by demagogues such as Senator Jesse Helms over the National Endowment for the Arts and other federally funded agencies, few in the art world cared to invite controversy into their institution. In fact, from the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, coinciding with the resurgence of Republican right under Reaganism, American museums, by and large, turned themselves into an analog of the immune system, and the virus they sought to attack and destroy was any art that referenced homosexuality and its then inevitable shadow, AIDS. When, on June 12, 1989, Christina Orr Cahill, director of the Corcoran, canceled that Mapplethorpe exhibition, The Perfect Moment, a few weeks before its opening and a few months after the artist's death from AIDS, she was, in her own words, protecting the institution. By this point, the question of federal support for any art that even tangentially acknowledged either queerness or AIDS had been so brilliantly and repeatedly manipulated into a wedge issue by the Christian right that content restrictions were easily voted into place. Thus, when the immune system attacked, it did so mercilessly, seeking to eradicate any visible reference to AIDS or queer lives. In October of 1987, Jesse Helms pushed through an amendment to a huge AIDS research and education bill that, in the words of the bill itself, quote, prohibit the use of any funds under this act to the Center of Disease Control for being used to provide AIDS education, information, or prevention materials and activities that promote, encourage, or condone homosexual activities or the intravenous use of illegal drugs, end quote. He thus managed to both fund and cripple the agency charged with protecting national health in what was tantamount to calling for a death sentence for the 2 most at-risk populations. And in a chilling barometer of the national mood at the time, Helms's blatantly discriminatory amendment passed by a vote of 94-2. Only 2 senators, Lowell Weicker, a Republican from Connecticut, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Democrat from New York, voted against it. As A.A. Bronson of General Idea noted in an interview about this historical moment, and I quote him, sexuality was a kind of dangerous subject in the art world then. To call yourself a gay artist would, of course, be the death knell of your career, end quote. And so I'm showing you, of course, another example of exactly this camouflaged AIDS work, A Year and a Day of AZT. The day is, of course, the large pills, the year are the small ones. And what's notable, of course, is they look just like a typical minimalist or post-minimalist art installation that does not necessarily call attention to itself as either political or AIDS-inflected. In fact, General Idea made works that were all about the extraordinary difficulty of seeing AIDS. This is their white AIDS. It uses the word AIDS just like Robert Indiana's famous Love logo, except with the word AIDS, but notably in white. Those are paintings with the word AIDS repeated, and equally, it's on wallpaper with the same logo AIDS repeated, but done in such subtle shades of white that by design, by intention, it's practically illegible. But let us not assume that this ideological sleight of hand resulting in the equation of gay art and AIDS was exclusively a product of the Senate's demagoguery. As the controversy swirled around the censorship of the Mapplethorpe exhibition, at the Corcoran, the Washington Post's own editorial board took pains to deny that homophobia was a significant factor in the decision. And the National Gallery's celebrated director at the time, J. Carter Brown, furthered this orphaning of queer art by advocating a politically astute, if morally bankrupt, division between gay subject matter and the civil rights implications of its censorship. This homophobic, AIDS-phobic immune response ensured that museums, by and large, came to regard the conjunction of AIDS and sexuality as the proverbial third rail. Still true, I want to note, now, over 25 years later, as I came to understand firsthand in trying to mount this exhibition, an exhibition that was proposed to over 150 museums, Art AIDS America, that turned it down. Another artist in this exhibition, Jimmy Desana, put it like this. I'm showing you his moving photograph, Gooseberries, and for those of you in the front row, can you read and announce what you read? Come on. Deathlessness, yes, but obscured, of course. This is what Desana had to say. There is a realization as a gay person in the art world that there is now a little distancing from the mainstream. This is something I never even considered 10 years ago. I never even thought about it until AIDS appeared. It has pulled the art world together, but in a way I think it's separated the gays from the regular heterosexual crowd, which is, I think, dominant in the art world now, end quote. But in order to better understand what happened to separate the gays from the regular heterosexual crowd, allow me to take us back to the moment just before the culture wars, a moment that is now so distant in time that I think we're all going to be shocked at the next image. That's Nancy Reagan on the cover of Interview magazine. Andy Warhol's publication. Inside that publication, Robert Mapplethorpe photographs. The battle lines were not yet drawn. In fact, quite the converse. This was Nancy Reagan's first interview after Reagan took office. She refused newspaper interviews, but she wanted to be an interview because her advisor said, the problem with being a Republican is that it's uncool, and Warhol can make Republicanism cool, so do that interview. So there we have it. But note that when mass media reports of a new disease began to emerge in the spring and summer of 1981, a New York Times story dated July 3rd, 1981, addressed an unusual outbreak of Kaposi sarcoma in previously healthy young gay men, they first called it gay cancer. Then they changed that to GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, specifically naming gays as the target population. Although the more accurate name, AIDS, was adopted only in late 1982, the damage was already done. To this day, AIDS is still, in North America, profoundly associated with homosexuality, despite epidemiological evidence to the contrary from most other nations of the globe. The political and social ramifications of this association between queerness and AIDS would first hobble and subsequently energize the political will to fight the epidemic. Concurrent with the rise of the new epidemic, a new kind of art and a new kind of art criticism were coming to the fore. An art criticism which can be generalized as postmodernist. And that's, I think, an important aspect of the story that I want to talk about. This is what activist art looked like when AIDS first presented in the art world. This is Daniel Buren's 1977 work, which chronicled, you see the stripes, the movement of those stripes outside the museum, see how they go outside the window, into the courtyard, and in a subsequent work, write on the metro itself. That's politics, folks, at the moment that AIDS presented itself. The art world, so self-congratulatory that it thought about inclusion and exclusion from the museum in terms of literal inclusion and exclusion. Political and social ramifications were not addressed. Daniel Boren was the leading exponent of what was then taken to be a highly charged, inherently political look at the conditions of representation in the museum world. But in place of an analysis of who is permitted representation and the institutional parameters under which it took place, Boren instead made work that literalized the fact of inclusion and exclusion. His work took the look of minimalism, added a dash of philosophical ethics, yielding a postmodernist brew with the heady odor of political engagement, but none of the messy to and fro of actual political commitment. Here was a way to feel deeply principled and still leave the mechanisms of museum representation largely unchanged. Arguably, this new postmodern tendency had its beginnings in 1976 with the inaugural publication of what would become the house organ and cheerleader of postmodernist art theory, the magazine October, and its first significant exhibition, Douglas Crimp's Pictures at Artist Space in 1977. The group of artists featured in this exhibition, named by Crimp to be the Pictures generation, had turned away from minimalism towards a new series of aesthetic strategies largely rooted in French cultural theory of the 1960s and 70s, theory that was then, and only then, first being translated into English and anthologized. As postmodernist art theory began to challenge, one short text above all others came to assume a position of prominence. That text is Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. Initially published in the legendary American avant-garde journal Aspen in 1967, it would be repatriated and published in French in that defining year of French political life, 1968. But The Death of the Author achieved a new currency and a permanent spot on college syllabi only after it was anthologized in Barthes' collection Image, Music, Text in 1977, a mere few years before the first cluster of AIDS were reported. Countering the common notion that it is the author who determines the meaning of any work of art, Barthes argued that it is instead us, the audience, who make up an artwork's meaning in the act of seeing or reading it. In The Death of the Author, Barthes elevated what he termed readerly activity, the interpretive act of reading, ahead of writerly activity, the province of the text or work's author, even going so far as to claim, as the essay's title underscores, that we didn't actually need authors because all meanings were inherently readerly. Despite the fact that subsequently Michel Foucault gutted most of Barthes' claims in his much smarter and much more historically reasoned text, What is an Author, from 1969, it was, in fact, Barthes' argument that steered the development of North American art. When Sherry Levine rephotographed Walker Evans's now famous Dust Bowl images, first published in 1941 in Evans and James Agee's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and showed them without commentary as her own work in a 1980 exhibition called After Walker Evans, she was seen as materializing Barthes' influential ideas on the death of the author. Evans's photographs were originally intended as a form of progressive, politically engaged reportage, albeit a particularly refined form, and Agee underscored their activist intent when he wrote in the book, above all, I'm quoting him, in God's name, don't think of this as art. Yet no critic at the time noted the peculiar restaging of Evans's fervent call for social justice in the white-walled confines of a temple to high commodity values, the Commercial Art Gallery. Here are some of more of the rephotographed images, all taken, mind you, from a catalog of the original publication. And I'm showing you all of them together, but of course they would have been shown serially. But then again, how could these photographs manifest any relation to social and political contexts of crushing, even lethal depression, poverty, when intention was by definition authorial, and thus irrelevant in an era of the death of the author. As Levine wrote in 1981 in her author's statement, and I'm quoting her here, "We know that a picture is but a space in which a variety of images, none of them original, blend and clash. A picture is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. We can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original." End quote. End quote. Like her photographs, Levine's language in the artist statement is itself an appropriation. She took and condensed the exact language of Barth's English version of The Death of the Author and made it over into her own author statement, simply substituting the word picture for the word text. Already at this relatively early stage, we can glimpse some of the lineaments of what would shortly become postmodernism's peculiar relationship to the social world it claimed to demystify. Ironically, for a critical method rooted in exposing hidden ideological values, postmodernist criticism apparently did not see, or did not care to see, that these had once been activist images. To their mind, a self-consciously activist art reproduced a simplistic account of expressive intention that ignored the many ways any statement was always already bound up in a complex web of social meanings that tended to contain, if not vitiate, the prospect of producing social change. In October, in 1982, in an article called Subversive Signs, the famous art historian and theorist Hal Foster celebrated this new postmodernist politics, and his hope for the future turned on the liberatory potential of The Death of the Author. He explicitly compared several male artists, such as Alan McCullum, and I'm showing you here Alan McCullum's work, which was made out of plaster, looked simply like black, empty squares on the wall. As you can see, most of McCullum's exhibitions look pretty much the same. You know, a classic realization of the idea of the death of the author. And he also talked about figures like David Saleh, and he compared them to female artists like Barbara Kruger and Jennie Holzer. But rather than noting the stark differences between their work, differences I'll make clear very shortly, he instead saw them as a collective endeavor unified in their common rejection of an authorial voice and an authorial identity. Thus, Levine's chief critical move, appropriation, and instantiation of the death of the author par excellence, right? To take something is necessarily to engage the death of the author, quickly became the hallmark of postmodernist art in the early 1980s, undergirding the work's self-conscious anti-originality was, of course, Barth's now famous essay. But let me ask you a question. What happens to the death of the author when the death of the author ceases to be a metaphor? What happens to a metaphor when grim social reality overwhelms its connotations and turns it chillingly literal? The answer, I think, is both everything and nothing. First, the nothing. The press, especially the art press, ranked behind mainstream newspapers in terms of AIDS coverage, and there was almost no acknowledgement of the rising tide of death beyond the requisite necrology until well into the late 1980s, at the moment that the first few museum exhibitions began to pop up. This, mind you, more than 8 years after AIDS was identified, after over 100,000 deaths. October itself didn't mention AIDS until 1988. But importantly, feminist artists such as Jennie Holzer certainly noticed what was happening much, much earlier. And their art was inflected by a desire to put this questioning of who can speak and in what context they can speak into actual political practice. I'm showing you Holzer's Untitled. In a dream, you saw a way to survive and were full of joy. And her Expiring for Love is beautiful but stupid. Of course, done on condom packets, using exactly the kind of typography that those packets generally used. The very title of these works conforms to one of the most enduring legacies of AIDS art and its various dissimulations, Holzer first labels each of these works untitled, then gives that generic untitled a sharp specificity premised on the work's actual text. You will note that same format of untitled plus a parenthetical descriptive title is now a standard art world practice. How many times have you seen untitled, parenthetical, the real title, right? But it began here in a cultural context that literally policed AIDS representation. So you could nod to that overwhelming policing by calling it untitled, and then clue the viewer into what you really wanted to say. With this untitled plus parentheses format, an AIDS-inflected work could at once nod to the prevailing sentiment of anti-authoriality and still speak. Hardly genuinely anti-authorial, Holzer's work is among the earliest instantiations of the kind of camouflaged, infiltrating, imposter-driven art that Felix Gonzalez Torres explicitly tied to AIDS a decade later. Only poetically postmodernist, Holzer here demonstrates how every discourse of control is open to sabotage, how counter-discourses flourish best under the cover of orthodoxy. Among the first stirrings of this new kind of pomo art, we can see right in Barbara Kruger's work here, untitled, Your Comfort is My Silence, 1981, which takes the prevailing ethos of authorial self-silencing into expressly political, even activist territory. Using the same now untitled format, Kruger deploys shifting points of reference, such as my or yours, to allow the viewer to ironize the ideology of the death of the author. Jennie Holzer's play with authorial voice began with the switching of genders and these really strong performative statements. Someone wants to cut a hole in you and fuck you through it, buddy. And then she produces these works. This is a big plaque that reads, "It's an odd feeling when you trigger instinctive behavior like nursing in someone. It's funny to be in his presence while a different part of the nervous system takes over and his eyes get strange." But note how subtle, even camouflaged, these politically inflected works are, so subtle in their operations, that Hal Foster saw them merely as an example of the death of the author, not as a critique of its too readily accepted premise. Artists such as Holzer, Kruger, Johns, and even Gonzalez Torres, then, counting on postmodernist anti-authoriality and its concomitant refusal to credit intention, were thus able to seed their work with a range of personal and expressive meanings they knew a theoretically sophisticated art audience trained in the death of the author would not see, or at least would not feel compelled to articulate. At the same time, they also knew that a broad general public would find these other meanings captivating. My point is that October's generalized suspicion of queer meanings had an unanticipated benefit for AIDS-informed art in an era of grave constraints on representation and a general art world cowardice when it came to challenging those constraints. Postmodernism's refusal of intention provided an out, giving institutional AIDS phobia, homophobia, or simple cowardice a motivated intellectual rationale, a gloss of sophisticated theory to camouflage its base instincts. Remarkably, this attitude allowed artists to address AIDS, if done with the right touch, directly under the noses of both Philistines like Jesse Helms and art world sophisticates like Hal Foster, confident that the viral meaning of such work would always operate either above or below their frequencies, as either too high or too low to be detected. And even more, the art world could point to postmodernist theory's denigration of authoriality to rationalize its own refusal to articulate the now dangerous identity politics that Helms and company had sought to police. In the context of postmodernism, that same art world could then reframe its complicit silence not as cowardice, but as the more progressive political position. And here's the kicker. In the face of the presumption that art about AIDS held fast to woefully under-theorized belief in expression, and art that refused to articulate a politics around AIDS was deemed actually the more engaged, the more of the moment, and finally the more resistant or dissident. This is one of Jennie Holzer's laments, which was engraved, as you can see in the lower photo, on the lid of a black sarcophagus. It reads, "The new disease came. I learned that time does not heal. Everything gets worse with days. I have spots like a dog. I cough and cannot turn my head." And it concludes achingly with, "I want to go to the future, please." Hardly anti-authorial, this is a work that ventriloquizes another voice for expressly emotional and political purposes. Something similar is evident in this work, Paultex Dust, whose one-word subject and title completed the year the artist died of AIDS complications, is hardly without significance. But perhaps the clearest instance of what I'm talking about, what I'm arguing, is here, in Andres Serrano's extraordinary work, Milk, Blood. Looking like nothing so much as typical hard-edged American abstract painting, it could be an Ellsworth Kelly, right? The photograph insinuates its AIDS politics indirectly in a title and subject dedicated to common vectors of HIV transmission. Not surprisingly, the other works in the series are entitled Blood, Semen. I hope by now that it is clear that there were two powerful streams converging on AIDS art in the first decade and a half of the epidemic: the aggressively homophobic discourse of the resurgent religious right, enabled by Bush and Reagan, and a much less vituperative but equally chilling theoretical discourse that worked hard to place expressive intent out of bounds, and with it, any account of authorial intention, biography, or politics. Together, these two vastly different social forces policed the representation of AIDS, one brutally, the other with kid gloves. But the net effect was that Helms and Foster, from their opposite perches and with very different agendas, nonetheless produced a virtual art world omerta around AIDS in the face of the most vicious attacks on freedom of expression in the United States since the heyday of Joe McCarthy. And once so many authors had died their double deaths, a literal death and a figurative one, few remained to puncture that expedient silence. But as Foucault reminds us, every discourse, no matter how oppressive, engenders a counter-discourse, a new way of thinking and framing that challenges the initial oppression in new and unpredictable ways. In the context of these two strong immune responses, which sought from high and low to banish the prospect of addressing AIDS, a new variant on postmodernist art was born. That variant's central characteristic was what Gonzalez Torres would have called viral or spy techniques, a form of art making that operated strategically and stealthily to suggest meanings it knew never to declare openly. Postmodernism's elevation of the audience ahead of the author proved precisely the cover art needed to appear at once, depending on the viewer's perspective, either as the instantiation of a fundamentally postmodernist anti-authoriality, or conversely, as works laden with expressive intent, like this one. We think of Wojnarowicz as the political artist par excellence. But notice in his Untitled, Buffalo, there it is again, right? An image appropriated from a diorama in an American natural history museum, one chronicling Native American hunting techniques. Obviously, its metaphoric relationship to AIDS is present if you want it to be, but not insistently so. Nor here, in Felix Gonzalez Torres' now famous Bed, which when I first saw it go up in New York, there were 21 of these huge billboards placed all over New York at the time. I actually thought this was a clever ad campaign for a firm like Bed Bath & Beyond, And I was just waiting for them to finally, put the logo on the damn thing. And then over time, right, and they were up for a month, those 2 empty spots on the bed began to resonate. So much so that Ronnie Horn brilliantly produced gold mats paired for Ross and Felix, in which she used 2 beaten sheets of gold, which, if you know anything about the properties of thinly beaten gold, have attraction and repulsion, so that they're constantly moving back and forth. This beautiful metaphor that literalized what Felix was talking about. Or here, in Felix's Untitled Blood, a curtain that required you to walk through it. It was over the entrance to the museum at a moment when contagion and fear of blood was absolute. I actually saw, when this was first exhibited, people hesitate, though this is only plastic beads, hesitate before walking through the curtain. And Jim Hodges coming through, related, of course, to the light strings, and his extraordinary Where Are We Now?, which took Felix's light strings and turned it into a network of flowers, hand-sewn, deconstructed plastic flowers. I'm going to skip these in favor of this one. I'm running out of time, sorry. This is a work by the unknown, or practically unknown, San Francisco artist Rudy Lemke, called Finnegan's Wake. And it is, of course, a pun on Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, the book that John Cage famously used in writing his lectures, where he imposed various randomizing operations to simply pull words out of that book and use them to spell what he called poems, methodics. I'm showing you Rudy's version. Cage's version were just random, and they would spell the name of composers or friends down the middle of the words. Rudy's are not random. Rudy attempts to appropriate Cage's method for direct and political purpose. He pulls words so that he can spell AIDS drugs. Do you see it? Pawnbrokers monopolizing desperation, AZT. Fuggus suddenly lost chance, facts resembling imperfect sight. It spells foscarnet, a drug, right, related to fighting HIV-related blindness. My point is that this kind of poetic postmodernism learned to take the language of that earlier generation and give it express and political meaning. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions, comments, fetching, whatever you have. Yes?
I have a question about the era of art that you're kind of looking at. I'm curious about... Thanks. I have a question about the era of art that you're looking at. It generally is situated pre-Hart, pre-1999, or 1996. I'm curious what you think about art post-Hart.
Right. Great question. And of course, with the advent of new treatments and the possibility of AIDS as it's now conceived as no longer an automatic and immediate death sentence, AIDS changed in its representational canon. And what happened is that many artists now make work about AIDS, often using the same poetic postmodernist tendencies we now see. There's an artist, for example, coming out of Canada named Sean Kelly, who produces works that say things like, "My AIDS doesn't fit in your museum," and he writes those letters out of semen in the work. But what's striking, of course, is that he doesn't have the same blocks to representation. He's using that tradition, but he doesn't have the same social conditions that govern its initial representation. Equally striking, many, not Kelly, but many young artists have no idea that the strategies like Untitled X, right, the parenthetical, were born of this era. It's become so automatic now to use feints to hide your meaning, to hide your hand and your expressive intent, that its relationship to AIDS is lost. Anything else? Yes.
Hi. I was just curious if you had seen the Lily's My Epidemic downstairs.
No, I'm sorry. I just came in today, just arrived, so no.
Oh, darn it. Because I find this work really interesting, especially in what you're talking about sort of in relation to death of the author and sort of artistic's appropriation of sort of like AIDS culture. Sort of the primary thesis of this work is, in the curator's words, AIDS is a metaphor for the spreading of like, I don't know, unsavory ideas to the general public. She's taken an appropriation of Barnes Melgard's Baton Sinister, and basically has led a seminar of this class over a couple weeks period where they produce posters. But now that the seminar has ended, she's actually removed quite a few of the base texts from the gallery space. I'm wondering if there's a point that you feel maybe this appropriation has gone too far, or if it's right for, you know, a straight white woman to appropriate gay AIDS culture as a metaphor.
I think that a straight white woman is appropriating AIDS culture is exactly a hopeful sign. I would like to see a generalized attention to AIDS. The more we talk about this, the more we see this, the better off we'll all be. And I also think that, if this is the work I think it is, this was up in Venice, was it not?
Yeah, she's actually, this will be the fourth or fifth variation
Yeah.
of this specific work. She's
So-
done a couple of them now.
Yeah, I've seen it before, and I was struck by the fact that it intelligently riffed off of a tendency that really, up until now, has not been commented upon. I mean, I'm talking about this, but before this, the import of AIDS to the shifts in understanding of postmodernist theory were not widely commented upon. So I'm pleased with this.
Removal of context.
I think a long time ago, early in the epidemic, at the Castro Theater, there was an AIDS film festival. And it was part of the Jewish Film Festival. And there was a huge debate that broke out in the audience because I and several other speakers used the word Holocaust. And some of the older Jewish members of the audience said, you can't use that word. That is specific to this moment, and you cheapen it by calling it a Holocaust. And I said that if we can't use metaphors like Holocaust to describe other incidents, then we've consigned that to history and killed it. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Hi, sort of jumping off of that point, quite a moving talk over there. I was curious about your thoughts regarding what you feel, or how you feel art really guides how diseases are perceived in a particular society, and particularly in the context of AIDS and cancer. like nowadays there've been a couple of recent exhibits in Vancouver as well regarding like glioblastoma and brain cancer, for example. And I'm curious about your thoughts regarding how art really guides how the society perceives certain diseases and how those end up being translated into science or research at the end of the day. And if you had like any interesting insights on that.
I mean, the greatness of art is that it offers access to a range of emotions and feelings that, by necessity, most of us repress. I know that I found putting this exhibition together remarkably difficult because I'd taken all of my feelings about this moment, which was a horrific one. I have telephone books filled with the names of dead people, and Emily Post doesn't answer the etiquette question of what you do with telephone books filled with the names of dead people. Do you cross it out? Do you throw out the book? Do you keep it? I don't know. But I'd put those feelings in a shoebox and I put them in the back of the closet under the sweaters. And then I had to deal with them when I started putting this exhibition together. And I found it weirdly salutary. And I think that what art does is give us access. It allows us to see through other people's eyes. So if we were not in the midst of what I refer to as the period of two Americas, one which was in the midst of plague, and another one which didn't seem to give a damn. If you didn't know that firsthand, this work will give you access to that, will let you understand that history. And if you did experience that, it will call you to attention to what you now, repress but once knew. And that is hopeful too. So I think that art is perhaps one of the most important vectors of cultural memory. And we tend to evade that when we refer to it as an aesthetic experience. There was a hand here and here.
I was just curious as to, well, I'm an artist and a lot of my work, I have type 1 diabetes, and a lot of my work comes from the experience of growing up with that. And I've been dealing a lot with, lately, trying to figure out how relevant a part that is to my practice, as my work is very emotional and it doesn't directly confront that. And I'm wondering whether it's relevant enough that I should be making mention of it, or if I should just allow, as you said, the emotional place that many don't get to access. Should I just allow that to speak for itself so it's a more relatable work?
I think that there's a fundamental difference that needs to be inscribed here, in that AIDS was socially and politically so charged at this moment in a way that type 1 or type 2 diabetes are not. But on the other hand, I think that if your experience with diabetes is fundamental, then making works of art that honestly and truly and authentically articulate its relationship to your subjectivity will, if nothing else, offer people with diabetes a place of relation. They'll see a mirror of themselves on a gallery wall, and that's powerful.
Hello, I have a question for you about, I was thinking about the prominence or the prevalence, or maybe I'm curious about your exhibition and the visibility of gay sexuality and gay identity and its political tension with AIDS. And I'm wondering where that puts visibility with other, maybe to riff off of what this young man said, around straight women living with AIDS, or around children being born into AIDS, or about people also experiencing the epidemic coming from other identifications or other subjectivities, and where their visibility might be held in this discursiveness and in this politic, and what are some of the artists and some of the artworks that are represented in your show or that you've encountered that also complicate this type of politic?
That's a great question. The truth is that in the early days, overwhelmingly, the imagery is made broadly by queer artists. And I think that's because not only was the literal course of the epidemic overwhelmingly queer, but the politics around the representation of AIDS and the politics around queerness were conflated. And so this became a powerful political issue. Only subsequently were there artists that dealt with this. But I think one of the most important ones is one that unfortunately I couldn't include in the exhibition because it was a room-size installation. And it was called The Lazaretto, and it was done by the artist Paul Marcus. And it was one of the most important and moving works of art, done very, very early in the mid-1980s. And what Marcus did was take huge sheets of butcher paper, and he went to community service centers and had HIV-positive women, mostly women, write on them whatever they wanted to write. And out of that, he made tunnels. So as you walked through the tunnels, you saw their words in a maze. And in the very center, he put a David Wojnarowicz image of a puppet grabbing money out of a bell jar with the words of Jesse Helms talking about how much AIDS cost America. And the words by the women were haunting. I'll never forget them. Things like, I have accepted the inevitability of my death, but who's going to take care of my children? And as you walked through that, you powerfully came to understand intersectional identities and new political configurations that had been up till then little represented. And I think it's really striking and important that at a moment when a number of straight artists hadn't yet engaged the thematics of AIDS, a queer AIDS artist gave over, right, a work to this other population and forced attention. I saw a hand over there. Did you? Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in the way your talk was gesturing to how these different artists like mobilized like postmodern techniques and this idea of the artist using the figure of the spy to kind of show something about AIDS in a somewhat indirect way that was still palatable to the art world. And I'm kind of curious about the art that was emerging at the time that was not using those techniques and being more forthright and vocal. Like I've read about Nan Golden's exhibit, Witnesses Against Our Vanishing at Artist Space from 1989.
Right.
And I'm sort of wondering what happens to the cultural memory of those pieces that maybe don't really fit in with the art world, maybe deemed too political, too emotional, but that were an important part of that cultural moment.
Absolutely, and they're actually in Art AIDS America. Because I didn't feel that I could represent this moment simply with this strain. But what I thought was new was talking about this strain. And that's why I've emphasized it in today's talk. But it is a epidemic moment, looking at all the different manifestations, including everything from, sort of demographic, so-called AIDS demographics, works by, for example, Grand Fury, to these very subtle operators. But I think that the work that addressed AIDS overtly and was understood as such tended to circulate until fairly recently, not in museum contexts. It was just too hot. Anything else? They're all the way in the back. I don't know if you really want to schlep all the way. Oh, okay.
It's all right. Oh, I'm talking in it. Okay. I've been to the show in Tacoma, and I'm just wondering a couple questions about the actual curation of the show. Something about the way the show is laid out in the space, which is, for those that have been, quite large and on 3 floors. And I wonder if there's an intentional or an intentionality about the intent.
I'm sorry, about what? I lost the last part.
About the intensity of the works increasing as you go through. Anyway, I wonder if there's an intentionality about the intensity of the works increasing as you move up through the gallery towards the top floor, or if it's just that we spent 2 hours in there and our own emotions got more intense as we got to the top floor. But there's definitely a more visceral quality to the work as you move upwards, and a definitely more sort of graphic, intentional, and not so much like these works as you move up through the gallery. And I wonder, I assume this is intentional, but if you have any sort of thing to say about this and about the way that that work was presented, if it has to do with timeline or the nature of the work or anything like that.
Great. A sensitive observation. Thank you. I think 2 things are happening. One, you yourself mentioned that after spending 2 hours with the work, you're much more sensitive to its social and political dynamics. I think that's happening. But as well, the show is not entirely chronological, but roughly so. And as you move through history, forms of representation can become more and more explicit, and so more powerful in some sense. So, the Burton chair is not something that most people see as political or engaged. In fact, I have had to instruct the guards to sort of deal with how to address that, because it is the work that most people sort of go, what the hell's that doing here, right? But later on, of course, the work, as you note, is much more explicit. Anything else? Well, thank you.